Herb's genius was he realized he couldn't be there for every decision, so he wanted to empower his people to make good calls based on what the strategy was and those 3 KPIs, which I think KPIs used effectively can be phenomenal. When you look at your own individual life, a framework for decision making around the resources you'll invest to win, we have 3 broad buckets of resources. You have them, everybody has them. It's your time, it's your talent, and it's your passions. I think there are generations of workers now that are lost. They're struggling to find a sense of identity, a sense of purpose, a sense of direction, and I think we can help.
In Search of a Leader is a podcast for those seeking more, a life of purpose, a career that truly matters, and leadership that inspires lasting change.
We have an epidemic that's raging across the country, across the world, and it's called employee disengagement. And unless we begin to talk about this, it's not going to get any better.
Together, we go in search of a leader.
Okay, I got to tell you a great story. This is the story of Herb. I love Herb. Here it is. So Herb's a lawyer by training. He never planned to get into the airline industry, but serendipitously, he ends up in the airline industry. He had helped broker a deal with a Texas businessman who said, I'm going to start an airline. And the airline was not off to a great start. And so, desperate, the Texas businessman comes to Herb and says, hey, will you be the CEO? Will you run this airline for me? Herb's knowledge, I think, of airline industry was probably about the same as mine, which is not at all. But he agrees to do it. And what happened after that ultimately changed the airline industry, and it taught me a lot about the power of strategy. For a lot of companies, strategy is one of those throwaway terms. We think strategically, we're strategic, we have critical success factors, but the harsh reality is for a lot of companies, it's not really that way. So here's what happened all those years ago with Herb. Herb takes on an airline that is failing, and he knows nothing about the industry, so he decides, I'm going to take a long, hard look at the market, the customers, the competition in my own company, and I'm going to decide to do something about that. Now, you've got to understand that at that time, the airline industry was dominated by a couple of big carriers, American, Eastern, TWA. I think Pan Am was pretty big. They dominated. Herb is in a very small area in the Midwest, and he realizes we can't compete. We're never going to have the long-haul carriers. We're never going to have all the extravagances. We're never going to be able to compete with these people unless, and this is one of the big lessons for me, unless we learn and decide what we're not going to do. Deciding what you're not going to do can be tough. And so he basically came around and said, look, there are 3 ways to win. And this is true for most marketing strategies. You start a company, you're going to have one of 3 value drivers for your company. You're either going to have best brand, best friend, or best solution. Best brand means I'm going to take a product leadership strategy. Think Apple. I'm going to have literally the best product in the category, and if I do, I can win. The best friend is I'm going to have a customer intimacy strategy. The customers are going to so love us that they will keep coming back. And whenever I think of best friend, I think of, and it's probably a little bit of a stretch, but I think of companies like Starbucks. You go to Starbucks, you buy 1 cup of coffee, you can stay there forever. You can use Wi-Fi until the Wi-Fi closes down, and they never kick you out. That's best friend. And then the best solution is an operational excellence strategy that says we can solve a problem for you better than anybody else. That's best solution. And again, now that I have a couple of grandkids and you're a contributor there, I've started to go back to fast food restaurants. And I don't know if it qualifies as a fast food, but whenever I go to Chick-fil-A, I love it. I mean, they're quick, they're efficient, you're out the door. I've sometimes left drive-through lines for other restaurants and gone to Chick-fil-A out of frustration, and they have 3 times the cars, and they get me out in 1/4 of the time. So I think Chick-fil-A probably is a pretty good example of best solution. Now the key, and I realize I'm overly simplifying strategy, there's corporate strategy, there's enterprise strategy, there's functional strategy, there's business unit strategy. But in general, if I've got a company and a brand, I'm going to take one of those value drivers and try to be successful. The key is to try to be elite in one of the three and at least competitive in the other two. That's kind of what you're trying to do.
Do you find that industries typically fall into one of those three just naturally, right? So I think about Coca-Cola, incredible brand value.
Yeah.
A lot of the equity in the company is tied up into their brand.
Right.
You'd mentioned Apple. Do they inherently fall into one of those categories, or do they make the decision, this is what we're going to do? And I have a follow-up question based off of that.
I don't know, but Coca-Cola is a pretty good example. Now, they're highly diversified now, but if you think about it, that's sugar water.
Right.
I would say, and they probably would disagree, and I'm sure they've got marketers that could carry this to a far higher level. I would tell you that when I look at Coca-Cola as a consumer, I look at them and say, that's best friend. Their advertisements make you feel like you've got an intimate relationship, and you probably don't remember it, but when they've run afoul of that and tried to create, in some cases, different versions of Coke, they've encountered problems. So I would say, whether they intended to or not, usually companies fall into one category or the other. I certainly believe that when you look at Apple, they realized easy to use. We believe in the power of simplicity, and they tried to create a computer that matched up with that. Whether everyone begins at that point, I don't really know.
How quickly do they evolve? Like how much time do they stay within one of those three value drivers? I'm sure they try to do all three, but do they pick a lane and stick with it? So Chick-fil-A is a great example. They started out with that best friend approach. I mean, my pleasure. They really wanted to build that close-knit relationship. They did very well in the Southeast. And then during COVID, I read an article that they saw a giant shift towards drive-through as opposed to in-house dining.
Yeah.
And it's funny how you kind of look at them as this best solution, quick in and out. I'd always kind of looked at them as his best friend, deep-knit, close relationships with their customers. Did they pivot on that, or they just happen to be both good at both value drivers?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I don't know if I can completely answer that. In my perception, it is so clearly best solution, but for a different age group, you may look at it differently. I think the question is this. You cannot, well, maybe there is someone somewhere that can win in all three. I've never encountered a company that could dominate in all three. The key is to try to be elite, maybe best in class in one, and competitive in the other two. And you've just made a pretty strong argument that, again, this is not a Chick-fil-A commercial, but it's starting to sound like one. They're pretty darn good in two of them, and that's not a bad place to be.
What did Herb focus on?
That's a great point. Herb realized I can't compete with United and TWA and Pan Am and Braniff, and so he made a very simple decision. He said, we're not going to be best brand. We're never going to put a better airplane in the air. And we're not going to be best friend, but we are going to be best solution. And so he said, look, we're going to deliver for one customer segment better than anybody else, and it's the business flyer, not the person that's getting on the plane to go to Disney World, not the family, but for the business traveler who really is interested in get me there on time, get me there at a low cost with no frills. If we can win that customer segment, we can maybe make it. So his solution was best solution. And he did something that's really amazing. He sold off some of the planes. I think the core group of planes he had in his arsenal were four planes, and it was a 3 or 4 state area. And he said, we're going to be the low-cost airline. Everything you should do should ensure that we do that for the business traveler, which I think was fantastic. But here's what's really, I think, the genius of Herb Kelleher, which, by the way, if you ever read about Herb Kelleher, what a zany character. He was, he made work fun for people. He once showed up, David, dressed as a chicken to compete in an arm wrestling contest to settle a lawsuit. And it was, it was highly publicized. People loved it. His employees loved it. He would show up at the gate to greet passengers. He would send cases of liquor to competitors. It was crazy stuff. He was like a part businessman, part stand-up comedian, and people love. I mean, think about that. He literally, and he lost the arm wrestling contest, and they lost the lawsuit because of him. But he didn't care, and the press, was off the board. So I think, in addition to focusing on best solution, which was genius because he couldn't have won in the other two, the second thing that he did was he became an evangelist. He evangelized the strategy of best solution, and then he did something that, in my mind, was absolutely brilliant. Because, you've got attendants, you've got mechanics, you've got pilots, all these people. And if you look at most companies, I would say 20% of employees understand what their company strategy is. I don't think it's 20%. I think it's less than that. I mean, you're agreeing, right?
I totally agree.
Yeah, I mean,
think it's not 20% though.
I agree. Which, you played a lot of football. Imagine if you go out on the field and only one of the 11 players on defense knows what the play is.
Yeah.
That's tantamount to disaster.
Yeah.
So in his case, he said, okay, I'm going to evangelize this. I'm going to make sure everybody understands the strategy. And this is what he did. Instead of saying best solution, focus on business travelers, all the muckety-muck that consultants and business executives come up with, he made it real simple. He said to every person that worked for that airline, we're going to have the best on-time arrival, we're going to have the lowest incidence of customer complaint, and we're going to have the lowest incidence of lost luggage. Those three things.
Do most companies have a value? If you went to the CEO of every Fortune 500 company, but really across all industries, big or small, and said, what is your value driver? Could they actually identify their value driver?
That's a very difficult question to answer. I would probably say someone in that organization can.
Yeah.
The real question is, if you went to the executive board and every person in a senior leadership position,
Yeah.
could they answer it? Maybe.
Yeah.
The data's pretty overwhelming that as you descend in an organization, the less people understand strategy.
Yeah.
So I would give you a guarded yes that there's someone somewhere that could. Whether or not they could embrace it like Southwest did.
Yeah.
Because again, that's the challenge. I say this often. For most companies, strategy is overrated and alignment is underrated. I would rather have a mediocre strategy that's executed well
Yeah.
than the opposite. Because if it's executed well, it works.
Yeah.
So I would say no, probably, to answer.
Well, I find it so relevant because I know people that work for companies and they're in the mergers and acquisitions team, and they're responsible for going and buying other companies that fit in with another company.
Yeah.
And I think about that, and I put myself into the situation now of, okay, what is the value driver for that organization? Do you know it, right? So in med tech, it's often been best friend. You want to have deep, intimate relationships with that client, with the physician customer. But I start thinking about some of the things that they measure towards. It's actually towards a best solution strategy. So now you're actually sitting there going, okay, do the people that are in roles that are supporting that company have any idea what the value driver is, and are they aligned to that value driver? And it's remarkable. So the other thing that you kind of creating a lot of interest in taking this and running with it, but in the healthcare field, right? So I think about hospitals in particular, and there's a saying that hospitals have: no margin, no mission. And I find it really interesting that they're putting margin in front of the word mission. I understand the logic behind it. It's basically saying if we don't run an operationally efficient business, we're not going to be around to care for patients.
Right.
But you think of the 3 KPIs that come with that, and they have 3 KPIs: revenue, cost, outcomes. The first 2 are dedicated to margin. The third is dedicated to mission. And I think about that in the transition that's happening really in the healthcare space of where the movement is going. If they go into a best solution strategy, this is the KPIs. If they move into a best friend value driver, these are the KPIs. And aligning with that. And I think the alignment that comes from the organization and then knowing who you go and work for as a result of having that alignment is exceptional. I love that. I wish more people would talk about Herb Kelleher because that is so applicable that I think everyone, regardless of CEO or entry-level sales representative, can get behind that and understand what is the actual strategy here at this organization.
Yeah, I think that's beautifully said. The company that you and your business partner started, tell me if I'm wrong, but that's a classic best solution strategy.
Absolutely.
You're saying, hey, we can improve the interface between physicians and industry and hospitals, and we can make what many people don't recognize as a problem much more solvable if we can put in place the things that we want to put in place.
Yeah, and it takes a lot of discipline to not deviate from
Yeah.
that. You want to build the best brand, or you want to build the best friend relationship. And I come from a world where you have those intimate relationships, but our job is best solution, and I have to keep myself accountable
Yeah.
to making that possible. So it almost puts blinders on to a little bit, but it's not really blinders because you're still trying to do the other two value drivers, but it gives you a core mission of where to focus
Yeah.
and not be distracted.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, I love that. I love the value drivers, love the KPIs that are tied to that value driver.
Well, the key is, to your point, you have to tie the KPIs to the value driver. When Herb came up with those 3 value drivers,
Yeah.
the industry, which was, it's a volatile industry,
Yeah.
but it's also a staid industry. And it sounds like a contradiction in terms, but it is. The industry smirked. They kind of said, okay, best on-time arrival, lowest customer complaint, lowest lost luggage. Okay, until Southwest began to turn a profit.
Yeah.
And then they did it again, and then they did it again, and then they did it again and again and again. Do you know that those 3 KPIs ended up becoming an industry standard? Most every airline has it now, but here's what's remarkable, and I think a testament to Herb Kelleher. The longest streak of profitability in terms of years for any airline, at least in this country, is 47 years. That was the airline he started, Southwest.
Wow.
47 years. The second highest, if memory serves, is Delta. They had 12 years. And the third is, I think it was American, had 7 years. They did it 47 years in a row. And literally, the last year, when the streak was finally broken, the year of COVID, the last year of profitability, the 47th year, if memory serves, was 2019. Ironically enough, Herb Kelleher passed away on January 3rd of that year. I always thought the symbolism of that son of a gun passing away,
Yeah.
the last year of profitability. Herb is a legend in that industry, and I think he's a legend for anybody that studies strategy. That is the story of Southwest Airlines. So I share that because, to your earlier point, strategy requires discipline. I sometimes get called in with this complaint, and I'm going to paraphrase it. Hey, Tim, we'd like to work with you because we think our strategy is rock solid, but we're falling down on the execution. Okay, well, tell me more about that. Well, again, great strategy, but we're just not getting it done on the execution, which in my mind, here's what I hear. We really won the game, but the other team scored more points. No. Strategy has 3 component parts. It has strategic thinking, it has strategic planning, and it has strategic execution. The first piece, the strategic thinking, is when you look at the market, the competition, your customers, whatever it is, and you gather insights and ideas. That's the thinking piece. The planning piece is when you take all that and put it into a plan.
Yeah.
And the third leg of the stool is the execution. So when a chief executive officer says, well, our strategy is great, but our execution is poor, what they're really saying is, you see, we put a great plan together and they screwed it up. They screwed it up. Doesn't work that way. And you probably see that in your world.
It's so true. I mean, it's amazing how just organizing some of this makes you better off. I come from a world that's very heavy in execution.
Yeah.
But what's interesting is if you have conversations with senior leaders like I've had over the last couple years, and they say, what percentage of your organizational success comes from building the right product, marketing, IP, commercial channels, all of that, and they say, oh, that's 90% of it. Okay, then where are you failing? They say, oh, execution. And they're doing the same thing that you're talking about. They're exaggerating the impact that execution actually has. And then when you ask them, well, what percentage of your cost is coming from execution? Like, oh, that's 30 to 60% of our overhead cost is on the execution standpoint. If you're blaming execution, I would make the argument your thinking and your planning is not organized in such a degree that
That's right.
it's an unwinnable situation. The Herb Kelleher, I'll continue to go back to that because it's so powerful. For the people that are executing, and I come from a sales job where that was my role. If I knew what the thinking and the planning components were, I could execute more appropriately.
The key is this. Again, I'll go back to Herb, and I'll use consultant speak.
Yeah.
If you were doing a post mortem or an after action review on Herb, you'd say, well, here's what Herb did that was really good. Consultant speak 101. He concretized his strategy. In other words, he made it real.
Right.
He democratized it. He made it accessible, and he operationalized it. He made it work. So now let's discard corporate consultant speak.
Okay.
Here's what he did. He made it real. He made it accessible. He made it work.
Yeah.
Raw, real, accessible work. That's the challenge. For a lot of companies, building strategy is the domain of senior leadership, and then they just pass it off. But to your point, if you really, and I believe this, and again, you have to risk of being overly simple, but when I work with companies on strategy, I say, here is a simple 15-word definition. Strategy is a framework for decision-making around the resources we will invest to win. That's all it is.
Yeah.
Because any plan I put down is going to change.
Yeah.
It's just part of life. I want, to your point, I want you to be involved in strategy construct, in plan construct, and certainly in execution. When you have the aristocracy that builds it and the proletariat that has to execute, it's a recipe for disaster. Herb Kelleher recognized, I'm not going to be there for every decision.
Yeah. I
got to make sure that that airline attendant understands if it doesn't hit one of our 3 KPIs, don't do it.
Yeah.
I heard the story once that a stewardess, an attendant came to him and said, you know what, I flew XYZ airline and they've got these really great meals. I think it would add greatly to our profitability. And Herb asked the question in so many words, what will it cost us? And tell me how it contributes to those 3 KPIs. And the answer was, well, it doesn't. Don't do it. Again, I think his genius was deciding what not to do.
Yeah. Evangelizing it within an organization. I hadn't thought about this in a while, and I wish I knew the gentleman that gave this presentation, but it was a hospital system CEO, or he was the CEO of at least one hospital that I know of. And his strategy was a best friend strategy. He was very honest, and we wanted to build great customer service for the patients that come into our hospital. We're getting them from EDs and et cetera. And he said something that really was so insightful. He said, we want to have great outcomes, but you know what else we need to focus on? Parking. He said, if we can't have, and he didn't use the best friend strategy, use that term, but he said, if we want to have a best friend approach, we need to have parking that allows the patient to park and easily get into the hospital. Doesn't matter if we have great patient outcomes if they don't have a good experience before they even get into the hospital. And I sat there, I go, wow. So now whenever I'm looking at hospitals that say, hey, we want a best friend approach, what's your parking look like? Yeah. And if it's not good, you're not aligned.
Yeah.
Strategy is a framework for decision making. And now you start to look, the world kind of opens up a little bit when you see it through that lens a little bit.
Yeah. Well, I think the world you live in as a co-founder of a company, I mean, you guys, you have to be strategic.
Yeah.
If you're not incredibly disciplined and incredibly focused because you're trying to change a market, just like Herb tried to do back there, and you're competing with a number of industry standards that kind of run contrary. So you have to be incredibly disciplined. And in many ways, you know, what you're trying to do, you're creating a best solution for an industry that's kind of done things for a long time because that's the way we do things. Yeah. And that's tough.
Well, you know the lanes that which you can be most successful.
Yeah.
Like you said, I have no other option. I have to be successful. In order to be successful in the lane that I'm operating in, I can't match the relationships that exist. I can't.
Yeah.
The big companies that are out there that are multi-billion-dollar companies, they already have an advantage. It doesn't matter how close I am or how good of a person or whatever it is, they have an advantage there. The product itself, they have more money to invest in it. But if I can be really, really good in the lane that I'm in, the best solution, the same way that Herb kind of scaled off some of the airplanes, if I can be really good, what is the equivalent of the business traveler? That's all I need.
That's beautifully said. Well, you know, for people that are listening to our conversation, one of the things that might come to mind is, well, okay, strategy. I don't fly that often, and I don't even check my luggage. Why is this appropriate? I think one of the things that we keep going back to is, look, if you can't lead self, you're probably going to be challenged, whether it's in a career or whatever the job might be. Strategy in our daily lives, again, we keep coming back to it. You have to operate as a chief executive officer. You have to think, you have to plan, and you have to execute. One of the things that we would encourage people to think about, I've used some version of what we call the core analytics for a long time, and I used to use it when people had to give business reviews. The core analytics are incredibly powerful for individuals. And it's 5 questions. We say, look, if you're not thinking about these things, then you're thinking like an hourly worker, and that isn't going to play. It's not going to play long term. The 5 questions, the core analytics are these. Number 1, where am I at right now? Am I fulfilled? Do I have a sense of purpose? Am I making a difference in the world? Where am I at right now? If you can't in some way determine where you are, it's going to be very difficult to figure out where you need to go. Second question is, and this is a powerful question, how did I get to here? What have I done so far? What are the decisions that I've made? What mistakes have I made? What have been my greatest successes? What have been my greatest failures? That second question, what did I do that got me to here? The third question is, where do I want to be? Now, most people look at that in terms of a title. I want to be the XYZ of XYZ. That's one way to look at it. But a better way may be, where will I have the greatest fulfillment, the greatest sense of purpose, the greatest contribution? Where do I want to be? Question number 4, how will I get there? Which is going to demand you to actually think about what are the steps that you're taking. And the last question is, what results should I expect and when?
The same way that organizations in many ways overestimate the role of execution and under recognize thinking and planning in terms of their organizational success, do individuals, as it relates to their own careers, do that same thing?
Yeah, I think it would be safe to say, and I certainly did, and maybe everybody does. I looked for the first 10 years at my career very tactically. I never really took a broader view. I never went up to 5,000 feet and said, okay, what's the landscape look like? I'll go back to the definition. And again, you have to be careful of being reductive when you give a very simple definition of strategy. But I really think it's a framework for decision making. Herb's genius was he realized he couldn't be there for every decision, so he wanted to empower his people to make good calls based on what the strategy was, and those 3 KPIs, which I think KPIs used effectively can be phenomenal. When you look at your own individual life, a framework for decision-making around the resources you'll invest to win. We have 3 broad buckets of resources. You have them, everybody has them. It's your time, it's your talent, and it's your passions. One of those isn't renewable. Time. You're not going to get any more today than I do, than Elon Musk does, than anyone. The time piece, I think for a lot of people is just, we look at it as infinite. And I can tell you, I'm at a point in my life where I realize it's not infinite. You don't stay here forever. So understanding that if you manage your time well, that you can constantly renew your talents and your passions can be powerful. That's why we say, look, take some time, go through the core analytics and really think about where you are as regards your career, not only where you are today, but how you got there and where you want to be. And that can be, for a lot of people, very powerful. If you're the CEO of your career, then you're thinking strategically. If, on the other hand, you're fully focused on tactics, you think like an hourly worker. Well, hourly workers are fine. I've worked with people that are my age that say, I spent 35 years and blah, blah, and, I paid for a mortgage and 2 college educations. I can't think of anything sadder than to look at your career in terms of time.
Yeah.
I would rather look at it in terms of what I was most passionate about and maybe how I best optimize my skills.
Especially the amount of time on a day-to-day, week, over the course of 40, 45 years, whatever it is, how much time you invest in that, but then also the time that it pulls from things that you also care about, right? So I have 2 little kids, and the job that I had, so one year I spent 163 nights that year in a hotel. And that wasn't even that bad. I knew people that did a lot more travel and overnight stay than I did. But you start thinking of the time away from things that you also care about outside of work. And you balance that in and you make a strategy for, okay, what life do you want? Don't be an indentured servant to your career and saying, I just want to get 40 years and go and retire.
Yeah.
And then what?
Yeah.
Then what do you do?
Yeah.
I mean, it's a life of quiet desperation.
That's
Yeah.
exactly right. I don't know if that's Thoreau or Emerson, but it's
Yeah.
exactly right. Well, again, when you start to change the way you look at things, the things you look at change.
Yeah.
Particularly as regards your career. And I did the math on it years ago when I wrote a book. I think most of us are going to spend at minimum 90 to 100,000 hours of our life
Yeah.
in a career. That'll get your attention. I mean, that will really get your attention. And I encourage everyone, whether they're a CEO or 3 months on the job, think about finding your purpose. It took me a long time. I mentioned earlier, I went to work because of company car, benefit, and
Yeah.
salaries. I can't think of anything stupider than that, but I had no idea of where I was going. Eventually, I found purpose. And purpose, in my opinion, is the intersection of three things. It's the intersection of your passions, which really are your values and your desires, the things that really excite you about life.
Mm-hmm.
Your passion, your skills, which are your talents and aptitudes, and then the opportunities. If you look at passion, skills, and opportunity, you begin to realize your goal over the course of your career is, if you Venn diagrammed it, to try to find the intersection of those three. And when you do,
Yeah.
you go from being somebody who just works to someone that's actually finding purpose and meaning in their career.
Yeah. And you try to, I love that. And I think it's a great visual that we want to share with people. But what you realize the longer that you're in your career, and I haven't been in it for too long, 14 going on 15 years, you make each circle bigger with time. That should be one of your goals, right? So if you have passion, opportunities, and skills, make your passion circle bigger. Make your opportunity circle bigger. Make your skill opportunities bigger. And then that purpose, it just takes over. One of the reasons that I left my career is it was great within a certain lane. I was selling medical devices, and I hadn't reached a peak within medical device by any means. But what I had realized, it was limiting my exposure outside of device. I had a certain disease state that I was in, a certain product, a certain physician call point, certain specialty. And I said, okay, how can I expand this network? How can I also start dealing with hospital CEOs, with policy experts, with insurance, with lobbyists? I wanted to expand that network outside of the lane. Then I also looked at it and said, okay, how can I build this skill set that isn't just really good in a procedural setting, but understanding healthcare economics, understanding all these other things. And with time, I started to realize, oh, wow, I'm taking this expanded network. I'm taking this growth and development opportunity. My skills are just exploding. And my purpose, as you talked about, the intersection of all three, it went to the moon.
Yeah.
Because I was starting to realize, oh, wow, I've built all these. And I think so many people take a job for the opportunity. Here's a job posting, go take it. And they don't realize, hey, you can do that, but continue to build the passions that come with it. If you don't have passions with it, just start and see if they develop over time. A lot of people don't know what their passions are when they're starting out. Sounds like you didn't. With time, it starts to blossom. But I love that because it gives people an opportunity in saying, are you just building one circle? Are you building the other circle and the third circle? And with time, if your purpose is expanding, you know you're doing the right thing.
Yeah, I think that's wonderfully said. Most of us start by looking at the opportunity and say, well, can I do this? Okay. Do I have the skills? Okay. Do I care about it? Do I have a passion?
Yeah.
No. It should be the exact opposite. It should begin with the passion, then looking at skills, and then looking at opportunity. Yours is a classic example, David, of you were so skilled and the opportunity had presented itself that you could have stayed there and had a small passion circle and a large skill and a large opportunity.
Yeah.
You made the conscious decision that said, no, I want a healthy passion.
Yeah.
I want to do more than on an infantry basis, help one patient at a time. Maybe I can help scores of patients.
Yeah.
That's the difference.
Well, it's just such a leadership standpoint, and leadership in terms of how organizations develop those three circles for their people, but also how individuals can navigate their own careers.
Yeah.
If you'll entertain me, I want to go to something about these KPIs because I think this is incredible. I came from the medtech world, so I built 3 KPIs that I was just thinking through. Taking Herb Kelleher's example of best on-time arrival, lowest incidence of customer complaints, and lowest incidence of lost luggage. Taking those 3 KPIs and building them for a medtech audience. I said, okay, what if we build best product performance, lowest customer complaints from physicians, and lowest device failures or supply chain failures? What that means is I now have 3 KPIs that if they're not going to those 3 KPIs, we don't do them. So if you're a sales representative that's now empowered by those 3 KPIs, you may pick customers and hospitals that if you have supply chain failure there, you don't call on them. And you've now changed the incentive model of the people that are executing because the thinking and planning are so aligned. I love everything about that, and I hope organizations really start to hone in on those KPIs by first starting with their value drivers and evangelize it, because you're going to have a lot of people that their purpose goes to the roof when they understand those KPIs and value drivers.
I think that's said exactly as it should be said. The power of strategy is that it should allow you to focus on what's most important and ignore everything else.
Yeah.
Ignore everything else.
Yeah. Thank you guys for listening to In Search of a Leader. Be on the lookout for more episodes to come. Make sure to follow us on social.
For more information, go to insearchofaleader.com.